Good evening, everyone, and thank you for logging in for tonight's event. I'm Earl McCoy Jr., Regional Recruitment Coordinator at Webster University, and I am going to be the moderator behind the scenes for the Webster Speech Series. Just so you guys know, Webster Speech Series focuses on the dialogues on race, equity, and inclusion in our society today. So just so you guys know our two individuals here on screen, I'm here with our host, Vincent C. Fewellen, Chief Diversity Officer at Webster University, and our guest, Dr. Donald M. Suggs, who is the publisher and executive editor of the St. Louis American. Just so everybody in the audience knows, this is our first virtual speaker series on issues affecting our nation today. Some of these issues that we are going to focus on tonight include racial inequality, police brutality, social injustice, and other unsolved societal issues. These issues have always been in our society, but due to advances in technology, such as the camera, we see these events brought to light. We're glad to have you join us in our important dialogue series tonight. Also, please tweet us any questions you like us, our host, or our guests to talk about, or for other future shows using the hashtag Webster Speech. That is a capital W in Webster and capital S in Speech. I will now turn it over to our host, Vincent C. Fewellen, and take it away.
Thanks, Earl. Good evening. I'm Vincent Fewellen, Chief Diversity Officer at Webster University, and I am so proud to host the premiere of Webster Speaks, Dialogues on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. Webster's mission of meeting unmet needs holds our core values of diversity, equity, and inclusion at its foundation. For over 100 years, Webster University has led conversation and action to meet challenges like those of which we are facing today. And now, more than ever, we are committed to leading dialogue, engagement, and action to lead our society to positive change. The unacceptable and tragic killing of George Floyd and so many other unarmed African Americans exposes our city, our region, and our nation's need to further deepen our urgency in these matters. This is an important part of Webster's dedication to moving forward on issues of race and social justice. As Chief Diversity Officer, I hope to bring you these conversations every other Wednesday with powerful voices from Webster University, the St. Louis region, and beyond. And I certainly hope that you will join me by tuning in and by asking questions of my guest and me by going to Twitter and using the hashtag Webster Speaks. Our first guest is a longtime fixture in the community and a longtime and dear friend to Webster University, Donald Suggs. Dr. Suggs is widely respected as the publisher and president of the St. Louis American, the African American newspaper of record for Greater St. Louis. He is an oral surgeon, a promoter of African American art, and he has quite the collection of that. And a civil rights pioneer. He is an inductee into the Missouri Public Affairs Hall of Fame. We are honored to have him. Welcome, Dr. Suggs.
Thank you very much. It's me. I'm honored to be asked to speak. I have a long history with Webster. Admired Webster for many, many years. And actually, historically, I was involved with some, not involved, but I intended some, at that time, we were operating remote. We weren't operating online. We were operating in person. We had some outstanding speakers at Webster. So I have very fond memories. I want to make a special thank you to Dr. Strobel, who has been willing in this community to be a spoken supporter of what I consider to be important issues in our community. So she's turned out to be an exceptional leader in our community. And so we're just very pleased that she's here and she has the kind of courage and willingness to step into sometimes uncharted territory, because she believes that's the right thing to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's been an honor of mine to partner with her as her Chief Diversity Officer. I can't underscore what you said enough. So 4 days ago, we celebrated the 4th of July, and it's a holiday which for many Americans celebrates freedom. However, for some Black Americans, particularly during this time of national protest for racial equality, the day doesn't have the same symbolism. And I don't think that we can really talk about recent events and our recent celebration of the 4th of July without really reflecting on Frederick Douglass and his speech that he gave in 1852. What to the slave is the 4th of July? I think it resonates astoundingly even today. And in it, he says, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. And the propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. He said these, more than a decade before the US even ended slavery. But incredibly, right, it seems as if he could have written this today. What are your thoughts, Dr. Suggs, on how far we have to go yet still in our fight for equality, some 160 years after those words were written?
After those words were spoken. Well, of course, the African-American experience in the United States starts 400 years ago, 250 years of slavery, and then subsequently racial segregation and separation. So clearly there needs to be a complete rewriting of American history. America starts with two great sins, not only the chattel slavery of African Americans, but also the genocide of Native Americans. So when we tell the history, we need to tell the good and the bad and the ugly. And so I think that what we're going to speak about tonight, I just want the framework to people to understand that the organizing principle behind so many of the institutions and practices and policies that we find reprehensible in our society lie in something that has been part of European thought, behavior, action since the 13th century. So it's not new, the whole notion of white supremacy. So if you look at it, as I said earlier, the organizing principle between a lot of the institutions and practices that we see lie in that beginning. It's what rationalizes the kind of slavery that Africans were subject to, and so it's not a pretty picture. But we're going to move forward. We're going to have to be able to start with the reality of how this nation did emerge. A lot of wonderful things happened with the founding fathers, but there are some sins that means that rather than celebrate, maybe we should just commemorate. So I'm looking forward to delving into this more deeply as we continue the evening conversation.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well. You talk about, some of that history there and possibly, maybe not celebrating, but rather commemorating. And I, can't help but to think in terms of the fact that we are seeing more of these statues of America's founding fathers and these Confederate leaders being toppled, defaced, or removed. And just the other day, actually, it was a statue of Frederick Douglass was knocked down in Rochester, New York. What's your stance on the value of statues as historical markers and as an artistic expression?
Well, I don't know about artistic, but I do know what the claims are for this being historically relevant. These Confederate folks were really traitors. They tried to establish a separate state, destroy the Union. I do think that on the other side of our some of these statues that we see, I would make the distinction between people who've made a real positive contribution to the country,
Sure.
Even though they have these sins that they need to account for. So I would make a distinction between Confederate flags. Now, obviously, the whole notion of monuments Yeah, talking about Martin Luther King or Frederick Douglass, and of course I'm in support. But no, it's the kind of hypocrisy that one experiences, and that's why we need truth tellers to tell you what the real story is behind these. These things were a monument to um, uh, the kind of the kind of tyranny, the kind of crime against the nation. And so these things certainly don't need to be celebrated, as I said earlier. They don't even need to be, they need to be, in my view, they need to be removed. And they have no, in my view, no legitimacy to be seen in esteemed public places.
Thank you. You yourself, you've been a core figure in the civil rights movement, going back to the Poor People's March in Washington in 1968. How would you characterize the current groundswell against police brutality and the broader social justice issues compared to the original movement in which you were involved?
Well, this is a moment, and of course, back in the 1960s, when I was an adult, that I was involved in activism, a very different time in lots of different ways. You look at demographics in those days, there were a country was 90% white, and there was some confluence of some protest movements. As you know, there was a lengthy war in Vietnam, and there was a lot of resistance to that. It was also at that time emerged the gay liberation movement as well. So all those things there was a confluence of them. But there was also a huge backlash against them. In 1968, Richard Nixon runs on he calls the silent majority, which is really a dog whistle in a response to earlier legislation, the Voting Rights Bill 64, 65. So Richard Nixon is the first example of how he took that issue and used it to appeal to white Americans. So I think that that's over 50 years ago. And we saw some improvement, some progress, but we can see some of these issues are so deeply entrenched. They never were really expiated. I mean, certainly not just Richard Nixon, but Ronald Reagan, H.R. W. Bush, George W. Bush, all of them were, in that sense, running against the specter of African Americans who were very marginalized in our society. So what we see in the current politics today is more, I think, even more outrageous and artless form of racial of racism. So I think that we will have to see what happens with this moment, because I was certainly surprised to see that these protests were not just African Americans who were outraged, because after all, when we had the incident Stand Your Ground in Florida, when this the whole slogan of Black Lives Matter starts, and subsequently, it seems to me even more meaningful was the response here in Missouri after the killing of Michael Brown.
Sure.
Almost 6 years ago. And I think that there's some very heroic figures in that experience, particularly Black women. And that was expected not to be very long-lived, just a moment, because Black people had been, unarmed Black people had been killed before, but this was a determined group of people that were willing to sacrifice sometimes their careers, their health, to maintain this protest throughout the winter. Seems to me that historically, if we don't see this kind of response in Ferguson, that we don't see the same kind of response one sees in Minneapolis. So I do think that history is interesting. It's some things that come together at a certain moment and I think the large issue here now is whether this moment turns into a movement. Hopefully it will.
I'm hopeful as well. You know, I think about my role and my voice that you know, post Michael Brown being killed in 2014, I was regularly on the streets, you know, using my body to shut down highways and to shut down malls. And you know, I think of Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving in 2014, we shut down every major mall in St. Louis that day. And when I think about that time, and I think about, you know, the three protests in which I've been involved in this year, um, the, the the demographics and the people who are showing up are just vastly different, right? And I am amazed by the way in which so many white folks have been moved to use their bodies and their voices to demonstrate. And I am hopeful, as you are, that this moment continues to grow into a movement. And I think, you know, if there's to be possibly an upside to COVID, it's the fact that so many of us were at home and so many of us were forced into watching the news. And as Earl said, you know, through technology and through the use of the cell phone, there was no way that so many of us could deny what we saw.
Yeah. The smartphone, yes, I think that every generation is going to have to make its take a position about its moral judgment about what's going on in this country and how they're going to respond to it. So it's to be seen what happens going forward. It's a very inflective moment. Polarization is one of the most important challenges facing the United States, and I think that we'll see what happens in the ensuing years. I mean, you mentioned earlier the demographic shift in this country from 90% white, the country is now 70% white. And I think 2024, 25, they think it will tip. So whatever kind of walls are built or whatever kind of policies are put in place, truth be told, this is a multiracial country. Now, whether we're going to be a multiracial democracy or not is a question to be answered. I think that there's an awful lot of stake for this country because if we don't respond to what's going on in the world, you know, there are many people find it very uncomfortable and would like to have things as they were. They will not stay as they were. In 1968, when one seen the huge, you know, the assassination of Dr. King, Bobby Kennedy, and really in a very important way, kind of it took an awful lot of steam out of the civil rights movement. And I think that at that 10 years later, a guy named Dao Xieping, he was 5'2", Chinese.
Okay.
He was a guy who had come through the Chinese Revolution with Mao Zedong. He made an announcement. He said, "We will compete. We will have a market economy." And so from 1978, when you had a country that I've been to China several times. And when I was in Beijing for the first time, they still had rickshaws and they were like dust roads. They have gone from that circumstance to the second largest economy in the world. They've had until 2018 for sure, their gross national product grew by 9%. They are the second largest economy in the world today. And the United States unless something happens to us internally, unless we find our way to become what we need to be, which is a multiracial democracy where we make use of human capital across race and class and gender, will not be up to the kind of competition that's going to be required for us to maintain the kind of stature and success we have in the world today. So it's really an existential question for the United States. It's
That's
not
right.
about being fair. It's a matter of, are you going to be able to compete with this behemoth? They have 4 times as many people in their country as we. And they have made this remarkable progress. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that we should have the kind of economy and the kind of society that they have. Having said that, they're a worthy adversary, and if we don't take that seriously, if we don't get our act together in this country, we don't find a way to become a full-fledged democracy that's more inclusive for everyone. Missed opportunities for this country. If we had truly ended slavery, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, if we, after Reconstruction, if we had continued and given African Americans a chance to participate in this society in a more full way, we wouldn't be having the same kind of conversation.
Mm.
And yet there was this propitious moment in history, and they allowed the South to become what it had been all along. It was slavery with a different name. It allowed the terrorists and stuff to set the country back, and it's cost them enormously. And now we're at this point in history when the problem's even more difficult to resolve and to solve. But if we are continue to ignore what is the reality in this country today, then I don't know about the future.
This is a moment for America at this time, right? Truly the reckoning of that original sin and the decision at this point as to how we will move forward, right? I'd like for us to maybe take a moment and see if we have any questions. Earl, if you could share any questions with us.
I'll be more than happy to. We have a fantastic question here. It reads, do you think separating out per capita crime rates into Black and white statistics is helpful or harmful in working towards valuing lives of color equally to other lives?
Well, I think, the question, I understand the question, but I think the question needs to be answered with a more kind of comprehensive look at what we're talking about here. I do think there's some things that probably are not handled in the way that's most appropriate. But we got to understand now, let's not talk about crime just in those terms. Let's talk about why we are in the place we are in.
That's right.
The notion is that this is all race-based, which is absolute nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
You will take the kind of experience that people have. And I know people cite these statistics about crime, but they need to talk about other circumstances people live in, and they should be measured by something different than race, because there are other factors that are important. If you live in the city of St. Louis, in the Jeff Vanderloo area, your life expectancy is 17 years less than people who live in Clayton, Missouri. There are 3 communities in St. Louis that are among the wealthiest 25 communities in the country. So you have to talk about racial disparity. You have to talk about what people's circumstances are. And so it seems to me that you're buying into a false argument when you talk about people simply on the basis of their race. There's a disproportionate number of African people that are poor, a different proportion of African Americans who grew up under certain kinds of grim circumstances. And so I don't think the measure is their race. The measure is what their circumstances have been. These young people were not born to this behavior. They were born under circumstances. They are forced into a wretched kind of life in the richest country in the history of the world. So I think that to me is a distraction, that notion. And, so I'd be a little bit suspicious even of people who raise the question, either that or they're naive.
And you talk about zip codes and you talk about access, right? And I as an educator, I know that the disparities that exist within St. Louis City Public Schools and Clayton School District or Ladue School District, 2 of which are among those top wealthiest communities in the country. And I had the fortune of teaching in Ladue and having access to things that advantaged students well beyond. And so, often, we hear this conflation of Black on Black crime and Black Lives Matter and trying to, if that's one, then the other should be. And, I can't help but to agree with you in the fact that we have to look at the circumstances and we have to look at what are equitable situations. And sadly, you started to speak to it when you talked about the Reconstruction, right? We lost that energy. We lost that momentum. We're talking about a group of people, if you're talking about on a starting line, right? Many of us have participated in this exercise called playing the level field. And it's, we all start on the same line, and based on circumstantial questions, determine whether or not you take a step forward or you take a step back. And sadly, I've done this enough that I've seen so many people of color step well beyond the starting line itself, while so many white folks are at the near finish line, just based on questions of life circumstances, from education to college to homes and wealth, that then set that apart from one another.
And social class. I mean, I grew up in the bottom 1%. And maybe I'm now maybe the top 5%. It's a long road. And I only got there by some hard work. A lot of people work hard, but mostly chance. And that continues to be a very difficult road to travel. So I think these arguments are not even worth, if people are serious about addressing this issue, as I said before, we're going to have a complete rewriting of what the historical reality of this country, of how this country was developed and what was the circumstances that led it to be where it is today, and the horrific crimes against people, against individuals, and much of, based on race. So, I mean, I think if we're sincere, we're going to have to be willing to have the kind of whites will have to be willing to listen to a very uncomfortable conversation about the role that white supremacy has played in shaping our institutions. I like to use the analogy, it's not an analogy, it's not true, but it certainly will give you some insight into how these things, the Jewish experience in Europe took place over, the oppression of Jewish people in Europe took place over many centuries. So the anti-Semitism of Hitler does not start in the 20s and the 30s. He comes to power in Germany in 1932. But he is using the anti-Semitism as an excuse for why Germany is defeated in World War I. Now, this had not been something that was deeply bred into the psyche of the Europeans. He would not have been successful. He didn't start it. Like our current administration didn't start these issues that he's raising to you about the lost cause and how appropriate and how heroic they were. These were traitors to the country, and they caused great damage to the country. And quite frankly, they had a chance to win for a while. They were winning the first couple of years of the war, and only superior resources, and I think a determination. Abraham Lincoln himself is a racist, but he is determined to save the Union at any cost. And I think that determination and the superior resources and over time allowed the United States to prevail. So we just need an honest reading of history if we're going to have a serious conversation, because otherwise we start at these points where it's not fair. It doesn't start there. You're going to give me an explanation for something, but you don't start with what the genesis for this is. Anti-Semitism doesn't start with Adolf Hitler. Now he takes it to another level, and this heinous thing that he does, this horrific thing. But this is deep inside the history of Europe and how they treated a people. What has happened with Black Americans, African Americans, is deep, deep, deep in the history of how they have dealt with us as a people. It's been in their religion, it's been in their philosophical tracts, it's been in the 19th century, was in their, in quote, science. They were absolutely determined that we had to impose on these people the notion that they were an inferior people. And so they'll cherry pick the Bible and talk about the descendants of Ham in Genesis to make their point, ignoring what Jesus really said about poverty and about all people. And so they want to ignore that as they have put together a very elaborate. So this notion that only backward white people feel this way, uninformed black people feel this way. Woodrow Wilson is not uninformed. You know, he's a PhD. He is an intellectual, but he is a rabid racist. He's born in South Carolina. His father's a Presbyterian minister, and that is bred in this man, this intellectual man. So erudition does not ensure that you're going to get a fair reading of what the circumstances have been for a people that now find themselves after 400 years dealt with in the way we've been. And guess what? Some of that stuff has been, it's been traumatic on us. We didn't come out of this unscathed now. But I can say to you that there is so much that's remarkable about our people to be admired. And I think that some of us, you know, that are fortunate again to be able to have better material circumstances, want to give up on our people. We must not do that, man. That's a horrible thing to do. I am so pleased to see some of these young athletes, this generation, no Michael Jordan's they're not trying to sell sneakers. They're telling you we're not going to accept this.
That's right.
Sport belongs, the talent that drives this sport comes from us, and we're going to collectively. And so you get someone like a Kaepernick who's willing, but there were people before him, Bill Russell, more outspoken. But the times now to see these young men who make huge sums of money are willing to say, listen, I'm going to stand up for my blackness. I'm going to stand up for my people. You know, they can't breathe. Black Lives Matter. And that, for me, as a person who's lived for a very long time, is very heartening, because people have to have a strong sense of themselves before they're going to be able to do what's necessary to extricate themselves from their circumstance. Now, that's not possible in a country that's majority white, but you fortunately, looks like we have some allies. The people that on the 4th of July speech by Frederick Douglass, these were white abolitionists. So even then, as they excused people of the time, that was fashionable for the age. Not everybody. There were people who were much more sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't hold other people in bondage, in cruel bondage. So anyway, I'll go on and on. So you have to stop me because it's something I feel strongly about.
Well, I appreciate that. The energy for sure is there. And we could probably go on and on. I would like to ask you, though, because you speak in terms of these athletes utilizing their voice to speak on behalf of their people, right? I see that that's the work that you do as well, and your team over at the St. Louis American. You all are, you know, as I said earlier in my introduction, you all are the newspaper on record for Black St. Louis, and then we all rush to the paper box on Thursdays to read that. And I'm curious if, you know, there's no way that we can kind of talk about history and not talk about the role of newspapers and media in terms of recording and preserving it. And so I'm curious to hear from you. How do you see the role of your newspaper, the St. Louis American, in that light?
Well, we live in changing times. I mean, as a boy, the Black newspapers were very influential in their communities, and they were very substantive, some of them were. As a matter of fact, as a young person, I was always drawn to newspapers. We were very poor, but we always had a newspaper in the household. But you had national newspapers. You had Baltimore Afro-American, you had Chicago Defender. And that was a time when Blacks were leaving the South. The largest immigration you've seen in this country's history, I think, was the movement of African Americans from the South into the North. Now, if you Mississippi, you came up with the railroad lines, you came up to St. Louis and Kansas City and Chicago and Detroit. If you were on the East Coast, if you're in South Carolina and all that, you came up to Pittsburgh and New York and DC and New York. So that was a very influential time, and the mainstream newspapers were not covering Black events. So Black newspapers were extremely important for information. I think in the current era, first of all, as a newspaper, you're going to have to also have your digital platforms. So our website, which is more timely, we come out on Thursdays, but there's there's activity on the website all year, all week long, and we have people that work on the weekend to be certain that they're covering the kind of information that African Americans need to have available to them from an African American lens. So we are evolving a model that will be relevant for the times today. The St. Louis American, I'm speaking because I'm talking about my team, not so much me. We start out with our mission as we see it. And our mission comes out of the conviction that we owe our people. That not we're giving back. No. We owe our people. Those of us who've had the benefit of the struggle and the sacrifice and the support of our people deserve, our best efforts to try to keep them informed. We want to also provide a forum where African Americans can share opinions and have a public dialogue. We also want to tell our stories, again, through the African American lens about some extraordinary things going on and the everyday lives one lives. I come from a family, third grade, my father and my mother, eighth grade, and yet I hold them in the highest esteem because they're extraordinary people. So we can't get caught up in some of these notions about how we measure people. And I think that the role of newspapers, of Black newspapers, extremely important, except we've had to adjust to the realities of the marketplace because these younger people, for instance, they want the information online, they want it right now, and they want it instantly. And you're foolish if you expect to change them in terms of they grew up with digital natives. Some of us older folks, I like the idea of having print, but I know that the kind of potential and the opportunities you have when you have these online platforms are just considerable. So I would say that the challenge is now for Black newspapers to be relevant to what's going on today and to be able to attract the kind of journalism talent. We see ourselves as opportunist journalists trying to make certain that certain information gets to our community, again, through our lens, through our lived experience. So that's maybe not a convoluted answer, but it's we're sort of evolving. And I'm always very appreciative for the support we've gotten from our community over the years. And it's enabled us to continue to do this work. And we're encouraged going forward.
Thank you so much. I'm curious to know, Earl, what are some questions out there from our audience members?
Oh, we have a lot of questions over here, but there's one question in particular that kind of sums up a couple of them. We have a couple asking about reparations. We also have some talking about the history of this country and how do we bring different people along, and also talking about what the conversation said earlier, the original sin of slavery in the U.S., the electoral, the local, and daily actions. But this question here really sums it all up. And the question reads, what barriers do you see for Black people in the St. Louis metro region still preventing us from advancing forward, especially with starting and maintaining businesses? A sense of freedom is often feeling as though you can start a business and provide for self and family. So with that question, they just want to know a little more about that, please.
It's a very complicated, complex question because I'd start by saying that maybe from my background in healthcare, first you need an accurate diagnosis of what the circumstance is, not what you wish it was. And you have to respond to that in some kind of way that makes some sense. My views on this have evolved over the years. When I was a young person, I believed we were going to turn this society upside down. And it turns out that's not the case. Matter of fact, there was a backlash that, after we'd taken 2 steps forward, we had to take a step backwards. The problems that account for our circumstances are very, very, are very entrenched. And I want to remind the listener that these institutions and these policies, these practices come out of a deeply held view about white superiority. So if you have a strategy that doesn't recognize what the reality is, for instance, people will criticize us sometimes for taking positions about candidates in elective politics. Well, if you think for a moment that African Americans are going to be liberated by elective politics, then you're being naive. However, having said that, there is a lot of damage that can be done. So often we're faced with people who are not our choice, our, not what we desire, but you have two choices. And to say that I'm not going to participate is, again, very naive, because you can see from the current administration how much damage can be done, and it affects your daily life. So I don't think there are any quick fixes. I do think that at the local level, where you have a lot more influence, your vote, your activity has a lot more impact than national or even state level. I do think you can work to have people in power who will respond to your concerns and your interests, and I think that's a step that you can take. I think that we need to develop a more sense of solidarity, because our strength lies in our numbers. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the United States now, the estimated population of Black America is about 45 million. 45 million people, that's the population of Spain. That's the population of Argentina. There are only 25 million people in all of Australia. There are only 35 million people in Canada, which means that collectively, we represent quite a political force. But we have to have the kind of solidarity. We have to be organized. We have to recognize that in a society where we are not the majority, where we don't have access to the levers of power in a certain kind of way, we're probably going to have coalitions around certain issues. And so I think we have to recognize our circumstance, and we have to recognize what's likely to make a difference. I think one of the things too that I just have to accept at some point is some of this will not happen in our generation. It might be something that happens in the next generation. It's a very vivid experience. I remember back in the 60s in the Vietnam War, and they had this man who was about to be shot, actually. And they tell him, "Don't you?" He's been out in the fields, barely on subsistence rations, and saying that you're going to lose your life. What was this all for? And what this man said, who was about to get shot, he said, "I have 4 sons." And so I think we as African Americans have to recognize that some of this will not happen in our generation. My parents, my beloved parents, were willing to sacrifice so that their children could have more access to things that they didn't have. And so we're going to have to do some of that kind of thinking as well. Some of this cannot happen instantly. Some of this cannot happen around one cycle. Now, that's not very encouraging news, but that's our reality. And I think because some of this is so deeply entrenched, we have to have allies. That doesn't mean that you look for someone that's going to be your liberator. You just say, in this particular situation, we have an issue coming up on August 4th, where they're going to expand Medicaid. An awful lot of our people are going to benefit if that passes. Well, we need to be certain we get to the polls and we vote to be certain that can become public policy. That should have been in place years ago. It was not, because the opposition was determined it would not happen. So I think that those are hard choices one makes, and because everything cannot be done in one generation. And I don't mean in any way to dampen the enthusiasm, the idealism of young people, because that's extremely important. You don't raise the issues, and things never come to pass. But the reality is that for most of us, we need to organize and plan and recognize that all this will not happen. We shouldn't be discouraged. We should do the best we can while we're here. But we also have to be very interested in what we provide for our children, give them an opportunity to take things further than we were able to take them. And I think that's going to be our history. Because remember, we're in a very deep hole. And it's very hard to extricate from the kind of hole we're in. It won't happen instantly.
Thank you. Earl, do you have another question?
Yes, I do. This is going to be another combined question as well. So there's one individual asking in the West St. Louis County region, are there places where you can pick up the American? That's a real quick question, is there? And then another question that goes to the main question about I just received a copy of W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. Have you read this? And could you give a little impressions upon that as well? And this is a main question for those two. It said, will panelists speak on the importance of word choice or code language on how racism is still very much embedded in our written conversation / media culture?
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned W.E. Du Bois was very prescient, but you got to realize that he's not the only Black intellectual in the 19th century that was speaking about our reality. And I think that the problem is that the ability to get your message out was not there in the same way. Remember, we were very much restricted to what was available and how messages were sent. And even during the slave rebellion, that had to happen by word of mouth. You just didn't have the ability to speak to your people. So I think that as I said, there are other Black thinkers from the 19th century whose work is very worthwhile as well. And I think that it serves you well to also have access to them. On the question of picking up the St. Louis American, we are primarily in places where people work and shop. But in the event that you can't have access to it in print, you go online, there's an e-edition. You scroll down on the right side and you click it and you'll get every page. Actually, it's more clear on the screen than it is in print. But we're in most of the supermarkets, particularly the Snook stores and Walgreens. So I think even in West County, if you have any question about it, you can call the St. Louis American at 533-8000, and they can tell you where the nearest place to pick up the St. Louis American is to wherever you happen to live or wherever you shop. And
What was that?
Thanks for your interest. Thanks for your interest.
What was that number again?
533-8000. St. Louis American. You can go online and find it. And to get to the e-edition, it's very simple. stlamerican.com. That'll get you on our website, and you just scroll down on the right side, and you'll see the current issue. And you click on it. It'll suddenly give you the front page, and then you'll have a little arrow that'll take you to every single page. Clear as a bell. Actually, I see the paper before it goes out, but I read it, do a second read online.
Excellent, thank you.
But thanks for your interest and your support.
Earl, another question?
Yes, we do. This question, how do you feel about the actions that are being taken by cities, corporations, and businesses renaming master bedroom, removing statues, painting BLM on major city intersections, Aunt Jemima, etc.?
I'm not clear. What's the question again?
So the question is trying to ask is your personal opinion on the actions that are being taken by cities, corporations, and businesses, renaming the master bedroom, removing statues, painting BLM on major city intersections, on Jemima, and how do you feel about that?
Well, I would start by saying remove Confederate statues and the renaming of military bases is I think a correct, necessary first step. I don't know in every instance what they're talking about, but the idea of people expressing themselves is, I think, a good first step. The question is, it needs to lead to action. So I think, in general, if I understand the question correctly, I would be supportive.
And I think
that's enough. I don't think we should be distracted by that. I mean, that to me is not. That doesn't get to the heart of the matter. But it's certainly why not? I think why not proclaim and be assertive. And the other thing about it is, I certainly don't like as an elder, to be undermining the young people who are out there on the line, pushing for some of these changes. So I'm always be a little bit measured in the way I respond to questions like that. But I think in general, I think that certainly in terms of Confederate monuments, certainly the naming the military bases, and some of the overtly sexist imagery on products that we purchase. Let me just remind people, NASCAR, whose whole base is basically, would you say they're more the Trump supporters? And they were asked, NASCAR said, we're taking down all the Confederate flags. Somebody says, well, have they had a change of heart? Not really. What happened is, because of the 45 million people, if African Americans decide to boycott almost any consumer product, they're going to feel it. The reason that Jerry Jones, who said when Trump said, get those SOBs off the field, and Jerry Jones followed up by saying, if anybody takes a kneel during the anthem, they're out of here. When you heard the comment from the president of the National Football League, you didn't hear Jerry Jones say one thing. And you know why? Because these people, the money in these professional sports, the reason they're giving this young man $500 million over in Kansas City is because they make millions, and they make it primarily from TV. And TV is funded. I mean, the funds come from advertisers, and these advertisers have Black customers. And if Black people are organized, if Black people decided they weren't going to buy a certain Korean car, guess what? You see a lot of change in their behavior. If we would just in any kind of way act collectively, when you have 45 million people, just think, I mean, if you're a market and, you're 10% of the market, we're 13% of the population. Now, we don't buy all things equally, but the commonly used things, this is a consumer-driven economy. And you take 10% of somebody's sales away from them, they got problems. So trust me, NASCAR was told, take the Confederate flags down. Now, these people weren't out there protesting against the Confederate flag. That would come to pass. Aunt Jemima would still be on those boxes. Okay, so yes, I'm for that. I'm for that. I'm for direct act. I'm for making demands, and I'm for people insisting that they want to be respected.
Yeah, and I think that that's necessary. I would also say that I think in some ways it's this overcorrection, right? So this idea I read somewhere where real estate agents were no longer calling master bedrooms master bedrooms, right? Yes. Or the Golden Girls, Hulu or Netflix pulled the episode of the Golden Girls where they have a mud mask on, right?
Right.
Appearance of blackface, right?
I mean, one might say that's excess, but I'd rather they sell that they err on the side of exuberance, and I don't think it's that harmful. I think that these are young people, and what motivates them is that they are interested in challenging and confronting, and so I'm not going to be critical of them. If I was strategizing, I would maybe consider that to be a priority. But if they do, God bless them.
Well, Dr. Suggs, we're coming to an end, and I want to actually.
That's a pity.
Yeah, it is. It's going by really quickly. I want to ask you, what do you want your legacy to be as an African American publisher, as a civil rights leader, and as a resident of St. Louis?
I'm just my mama and my daddy's son, and I hope I raised my children who grew up from a material point of view, much more privileged than myself. And I'm just pleased that all of them have a social concern, social conscience. And they didn't grow up as I did, but they still, all of them have been activists during their lives. My son's passed away a few years ago, but they've all been deeply steeped in the idea of the importance of having a love for your people and having a deep connection to them. And because my legacy is as a working class boy who got some breaks, came along at a certain time. My father, who's so much more, much more intelligent, more everything than me, just did not have the opportunities. And he made a lot of sacrifices. So to get back to your question about legacy, I believe that whatever, I mean, I'm very interested in the fact that we, have a newspaper that I think, does have some value for the community. And I am just indebted. And so I have no personal feelings about my legacy. That's not something I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is to try to be of some service um, to a community that's long been denied the kind of justice, and to stop some of the suffering that goes on with people. That's very painful. I mean, I'm never indifferent to the suffering of our people. And those of us who are in a position to maybe do a little something on their behalf, and that's, if anything, that would be it. That would be it. To try to be of some service.
Well, you certainly have been that to us here in St. Louis. And as a Black St. Louis, and I want to thank you for that service that which you've provided. Certainly want to thank you as Chief Diversity Officer for your time here tonight with us. But before I say goodbye, I want to bring on your friend, Chancellor Strobel, who will say a few words to us. As we're bringing her on, I want to invite all of our guests to join us on July 22nd, back here, where we will host Michael McMillan, President and CEO of the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis, and Mayor Ella Jones, Mayor of Ferguson, the first elected Black Mayor of Ferguson, first female as well. And I know that they both are friends of yours as well. And
outstanding, both outstanding people.
Yes. So I hope everyone will join us on July 22nd for that show. And meanwhile, we're going to switch over to Dr. Strobel, who's going to say a few words to us as well. There you are.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much, Vincent. Fabulous questions. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in. Earl, thank you for fielding the questions from Twitter and from chat, but particularly Dr. Suggs. Since I first moved to St. Louis and very much thought that everywhere I've lived, I sort of took a value from my parents, which was bloom where you're planted.
Yes.
Figure out what makes this place tick and what your part can be in it, and then seize the opportunity. But figure out who the allies are and ground yourself in the history. And I just remember how consistently across all these years, you have been such a source of advice and history and grounding and encouragement for me and for Webster. So I come into this night's opportunity as someone who is a student of history, and I love the way you ground us in the history of really the world, and as an educator. And fundamentally, an educator is about exactly what you're talking about, which is, of course, we need to move things forward individually and institutionally, and take advantage of the opportunity to make a difference that we have now. And at the same time, empower and encourage the next generation and equip them with the tools and the knowledge to make it go farther than we're able to in our leadership in our lifetime. And so I come away tonight just feeling like this was the ideal way to start Webster Speaks, because we've had the opportunity as Webster to listen. We've had the opportunity to celebrate. I remember quite well when we awarded you at our Diversity and Inclusion Conference the Champion for All Award. And why? Because the integrity of your words and actions are the model for each and every one of us. So I encourage Webster to not only speak and listen and celebrate, but for Webster to act. And you have given us a great start. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Strobel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Strobel, for everything. and I didn't get a chance to speak about some of the specific things you've done in your leadership that has set the bar in a city like, in an area like St. Louis, people who now are responding to what you were willing to pioneer, you were willing to, I don't think you ask anyone. I don't think you put your finger in the wind to see how it was blowing. You just said, I want to do this. I think it's right. And that's been a hallmark of your career here in St. Louis. And we're just fortunate to have your leadership and me to have your friendship. He's a great gift to me. Thank you.
Thank you. There's still more work to do, and
oh yes, absolutely.
We're eager to keep going.
Yeah, we're up to it too. We're up to it, right?
We are indeed. So
we're up to it. Right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks again to you both for those final words. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining in and for using hashtag Webster Speaks. Please continue to use it. Post some additional questions or thoughts about additional shows that you would like for us to produce and to have out there for conversation. Again, July 22nd, Michael McMillan and Mayor Ella Jones. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a good night and be well. Thank you.